Hello, my name is Professor Deana Pollard Sacks, and you're watching Meet the Professors. Today we're going to be talking about the politics of the media. I have two guests with me today. The first guest is Ed Donnerstein, who is Dean Emeritus at the University of Arizona and a past president of the International Society for Research on Aggression. Thank you for joining us, Ed. Craig Anderson is also with us, and he is a professor of psychology, distinguished professor in liberal arts and sciences, and the director of the Center for the Study of Violence at Iowa State University. He is also a past president of the International Society for Research on Aggression. Thank you for coming, Craig.
Thank you.
Well, my first question is for Ed, and I remember you from so many years ago when I was in law school. I was a third-year law student, and I actually cited you, 20 years before I met you, about your work with the Meese Commission. And could you just tell us a little bit about your experience with the Meese Commission and the report in particular?
The word disheartening aloud?
Yes.
This goes back almost 30 years. A large number of researchers testified, and we were very honest and open about the research and talking about the nuances of the research. And when the report came out, I think we were quite surprised that lots of the things we talked about were completely turned upside down. Certain things were picked, certain things weren't. We disagreed enough with the conclusions that a number of us wrote a number of law review articles at that time saying they got it wrong.
And just to be clear, this is Reagan commissioned this report, and it's a report on pornography.
On pornography
and the effects of pornography.
And I think what people forget, about a month later, C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General of the United States, also had a workshop or commission, whatever you want to call it, inviting in pretty much exactly the same researchers. Came out with a totally different finding, which we all agreed with.
See, that's scary to me because I think
one is for health, one is for politics. Right. There's a big difference.
Well, that's what's scary is because when a report comes from the government, and particularly the federal government, you think you can trust it. And I remember hearing about your work from Erwin Chemerinsky, my professor at USC, and I wrote an article then called Regulating Violent Pornography, because as I recall, your research showed that violent pornography could lead to violent behaviors, but that regular pornography, or garden variety nonviolent, does not lead to aggression or violence.
Yeah, we were very clear that sexually explicit, mutually consenting material really wasn't having effects, and that's what the Surgeon General's report said. But the Meese Commission just lumped all these together. It's very broad.
And what did the report basically say?
That all types of material are harmful, and therefore we should regulate more, try to do something, be more proactive in terms of stopping the sale of the material, set up new types of centers in the Justice Department to do this. It was interesting. Surgeon General, if you know C. Everett Koop, called for sex education programs to try to deal with the problem.
Right.
But the problem was violent material.
But it's fair to say the report was just, it was fraudulent. It wasn't true at all. It was
completely. I took the research, and I think
right.
It wasn't what we said.
Yeah.
In the commission, in our testimony.
See, I think the public has a tendency to believe a report produced by the federal government, and that's what concerns me, is that you think you can trust the news, for example. Like, we kind of all know you can't trust advertisers, right? A lot of people believe that because they're out to get you to buy their products. And for example, some of the things the tobacco industry has done has been, really underhanded, targeting children for advertisements. They spend, $12 billion a year on advertisements. Alcohol spends $5 billion a year, and prescription drugs $4 billion a year. So, there's kind of a common knowledge that you can't. When an advertisement comes on TV, you kind of almost have to tune out because they're just trying to get you to buy something. My concern is more about news media and government reports, because people, I think, still tend to believe that you can believe them, and I think that the politics of what's going on in our media is something that needs to be really looked at by the public. Now, Craig, you also mentioned something about a lawyer, and I have to say, lawyers are kind of known for not always being honest in court, but will you share your story about what happened at the St. Louis County Executive Commission in 2000?
Yes, that was my first foray into essentially sharing the science with a political body. This was in the St. Louis County group. But they had asked me to come and talk to them about violent video games because they were considering passing a law that would restrict certain kinds of games to, from minors. One of the interesting things that happened at this hearing was the video game industry lawyer, as part of her presentation, made reference to a recent FBI report on school shootings and identifying risk factors and all of that. And one of the things that she very explicitly said is that there's no mention of violent video games or violent media being a risk factor. And in fact, there's a paragraph in the report that specifically says, this is a risk factor. And the attorney for the county, who was in the audience during this presentation, stopped the video game industry's attorney and said, "Well, that's not true. I have a copy of the FBI report right here."
Right.
And the industry's lawyers, her response was, it didn't faze her in the least. It was almost like that part was rehearsed as well. So, really? Would you share a copy of that with me? I must have a different version. And, at that point you could sort of say, okay, it's possible that this was just a mistake. But about a year later, I was at a conference on video games and digital media and whatnot, in which the same attorney was giving a talk. And in her talk, she made the same bold-faced lie to this whole audience. I tried to call her out on it, but in part because of the structure of the way the session was running, and in part because maybe whoever was running the panel didn't want that. I didn't really get the opportunity to point out that that's not true, and that she knows that that's not true.
Right.
So that was quite an eye-opener for me. That I understand, and at least I think I understood at the time, that certainly the industry's lawyers would selectively present information, but to actually make it up was quite a revelation.
Well, it's a real problem in the legal field. We're actually going to have another show about that, and it's gotten so bad with lawyers just becoming really audacious in their perjury in court. We'll be talking about another show anyway, but I was going to ask you in general, how would you say the news media has handled the research on violent video games? Have they been honest and open, or have they been very slanted with their representations of what the research has shown?
What I think happened historically is when the first few studies started coming out showing harmful effects, reporters and news organizations saw, well, this is a way to sell some more.
Right.
Sell some more papers, or get more hits on the internet, and those studies were reported and probably exaggerated to some extent in the early days. But what happened over time is that the news reports have been watered down systematically over time. That they now almost always include a counterpoint that sort of leaves the viewer feeling that there's no real evidence one way or another. And in fact, Brad Bushman and I did a study a number of years ago showing that as the research evidence got stronger, showing that media violence effects are real and are not just some sort of random bad study. As the research evidence got stronger over time, the news reports about the research evidence actually went the other direction. It got weaker. And that phenomena has since been replicated just in the last couple of years.
Gosh, we're talking about children. You'd think that people would have a little more morality when it comes to the truth about what these games can do to children.
Well, and there's a lot of interesting hypotheses about why this is happening. One, the simple one is they're out to sell their product, and controversy sells. So, let's try to make this more controversial. Another possible reason why some of this is happening is you have to look at who owns media violence. Companies that make money from selling media violence, who advertises where, and who owns news media. And so there's certainly with the consolidation of ownership of television stations and internet-based news sources and so on, you have to be a little bit concerned about whether there's direct pressure from the top to skew.
Well, when Activision and Blizzard merged, it was reported that they are now worth $30 billion. $30 billion. I mean, that's like oil company money. That's huge. And these produce, of course, a lot of the big video games.
Right. But there's a third. There's a less evil explanation as well, right? And the less evil one is you have to ask about what are the values and the belief systems of people who go into news reporting, right? That they are self-selected for being opposed to and being threatened by anything that might suggest some sort of action that would restrict their freedom to print what they want. These are people who are very die-hard, very strong believers in the First Amendment, which actually also describes most of the media violence researchers as well. But as researchers, we emphasize staying true to the data as being more important than anything else. And most of us don't really see any strong link between what the research says and what public policy, that might follow from it.
I mean, factually incorrect speech has always been punishable. Defamation law certainly speaks to that. And the court has said many times there's no such thing as a false idea, but we're talking about research. It seems to me that there is a line there. A friend of mine named Chris Guzlian does research on whether the First Amendment is a shield for false scientific speech. And he argues that it is not a shield. And he sort of got attacked by other professors for saying that. And that's how I met him. I saw it, and now we're friends because I called him about it. I said, I think you're right about that. But listen to this quote, because I think this is really, really telling. And this is from a quote from New World Communications versus WTVT. This is a case from 2003, and it's the Florida Second District Court of Appeal. And what happened was Jane Aker is a reporter, and she was doing a story on growth hormones put in milk and being served to children. And there was evidence that it caused cancer and many other very serious problems. So she was working for this company that was owned by Fox, owned by Rupert Murdoch, ultimately, who owns 800 media companies, which is a little scary. One man owning so many media sources. And she won the trial, $425,000, because they fired her when she wouldn't run the story the way they wanted her, because she wouldn't take out the truth about what the research was showing in terms of the very dangerous problems with this growth hormone. And the station appealed, and listen to what the court said. We agree with WTVT that the FCC's policy against the intentional falsification of the news, which the FCC has called its news distortion policy, does not qualify as a required law, rule, or regulation under the Florida whistleblower statute. Meaning, if you don't have a predicate law violation upon which to base your whistleblower claim, you can't maintain your suit. They reversed it and whacked her with a ton of attorney's fees. Are you kidding me that the news has a right to falsify? I mean, that's not what the First Amendment was about. In fact, the First Amendment's fundamental policy is to bring out the truth through dissemination of different ideas and the smorgasbord of ideas, all of that. So I found this really offensive, especially because I did do wrongful termination lawsuits, and I just was shocked to read this, that the news is allowed to intentionally falsify scientific data because it hasn't been technically, there were cases regarding it in the FCC system, but there was no actual law passed. So the court here is saying, and this is, by the way, Patricia Kelly, joined by Daryl Casanueva and Oliver Green out of Florida. So these are the three judges who gave us this wonderful opinion. And I just find it amazing because I believe that there's a lot of results-oriented decision-making going on in the courts. And had they wanted to find that she stated a claim, they could have said that this is, wrongful termination in violation of public policy. And they didn't have to be so technical, but basically the bottom line is, the news can lie to us. That brings up something Ed sent me a couple weeks ago. This came out on June 15th of this year, just a few weeks ago, in the New York Times by a reporter named Nick Bilton. This is what he says. Studies on the impact of video game violence by research institutes, universities, and psychologists have been inconclusive. For seemingly every report that says video games lead to real-world shootings, there have been others rebutting those claims. Is that a true statement?
No.
No.
I mean, what's interesting about the statement is there's two issues. One is he's basically telling the reader for every study finding an effect, there's a counter one. That's not true at all, as it turns out. And secondly, he couches it within mass shootings, which are very low,
Right.
rarely occurring event. But it's saying there's a debate.
Right.
And this debate is equal.
Right.
And in fact, that's not the case. Not that you wouldn't present both sides, but it's quite interesting. You would never see a comment like that about climate change. You would say 95% of researchers have shown X. There's a few who don't, but the general consensus. What is interesting in that statement, it sounds like it's a one-to-one. And any reader who's not familiar with the research is going to say, well, he's right. It's inconclusive. I guess
well,
for every
people
study
just
we have
accept things. They accept. The New York Times is considered a very credible newspaper, and so this. I mean, God knows how many people got a hold of the story, but I read that too, and I said, well, that is completely untrue, and yet it's been published. And then the other thing he does, I thought, was kind of just. A little underhanded, was couching it in terms of, for every study that says video games lead to real-world shootings, I don't think we have a single study like that, do we? So what's he talking about?
There are no studies. Yeah, exactly right. There are no studies that specifically link violent video game play to shootings. In fact, I don't think there are any television movie violence studies. No. Not true empirical science type studies.
Right. I mean, there's anecdotal stories. I mean, for example, the Columbine shooters, those high school kids, and the Heath High School shooters both had the same movie in their rooms, as well as a lot of violent video games. You know what movie that was? The Basketball Diaries, where Leonardo DiCaprio had a dream sequence. He wore a long trench coat and a big gun, I guess a shotgun, or I'm not sure what it was, and he had this dream in the movie where he walked into the school and blew away a lot of his classmates. Well, in Columbine, they literally copycatted not just what he did, but his dress, the kind of gun he used. I mean, that doesn't prove it caused it, but they certainly did a copycat crime. That's clear.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the issues, I think, for a lot of the reporting here, and Craig's quite right what he said earlier, that the two groups have become more and more divergent as the research has been, I think, more consistent. You find the news saying there's a debate, there's inconsistency, and a lot of it has to be, well, we have to find two sides. No, you don't. I mean, to me, sometimes the other side just isn't necessarily credible. We have a good colleague, Doug Gentile, who always comments. You could certainly go out there and find maybe even a professor or a scientist who says the world is flat. I mean, do you go ahead and report this
Exactly right.
And make it the same? And I think that's what's happened here, not only with the video game violence, but with a lot of these types of effects. And that's been going on for quite a while. And
well, it's really scary.
There are two sides.
But there really aren't. I mean, there's like some people have opinions that are valid and backed up. Other people have opinions that really make no sense and fly in the face of all the research. And something happened years ago. I've been involved with the Corporal Punishment debate, and it's really not much of a debate. I mean, Murray Strauss and Joan Durant and Robert Fathman. I mean, these people are all, we all know each other. We all see each other. We're on the board of Epoch USA. And all of a sudden, this report came out by a professor, I think two professors. One of them was at Berkeley. And the report basically said that spanking can be effective and it doesn't necessarily hurt the child or something like that. And we all said, who is this person coming from out of the blue, out of left field, someone no one had ever heard of? And guess what? She was all over the news because she was willing to say something that was just not consistent with the vast majority of research, and an unknown person therefore got the spotlight. And I think that's starting to happen in the academies, and that's dangerous because we think of professors as being nonpartisan and as being objective because we don't get paid for what we say. Some certain people in the academies have egos and they want to be on the news, and if they produce a study that is completely inconsistent with the other research, lo and behold, their name is all over the newspapers because it's news that someone's saying that corporal punishment and spanking children is somehow okay. So is that kind of going on in your industry as well?
It's hard to say. There are examples of professors who have become famous, essentially, by denying what every other major researcher, not just in the U.S., but in the world, has found, again, in this media violence domain.
Right.
Why they're doing it, I mean, I think there are a lot of personal reasons having to do with personal preferences and beliefs. I don't know how new this is, but it used to be very hard for that kind of approach to succeed.
Right.
There are all kinds of benefits to all the information that's now available on the internet. I mean, and I love that. But one of the bad things is the internet makes it easy to disseminate lots of wrong information, factually incorrect information as well. And that has, I think, started to seep into the academy in multiple ways. One way is the proliferation of journals, including online journals, means that there are fewer and fewer qualified editors and reviewers for the mass of junk that's out there. One of the things that scientific journals historically have always done, one of their major functions was to weed out the nonsense, and to highlight and emphasize, bring attention to good research. Whether that new research contradicts prevailing wisdom or not was not the issue. Was the research done in a reasonable way? Does it follow standard scientific practices? But what we're now seeing is we're seeing special issues edited by people who have almost no publications on the topic that they're the special issue editor for. And we're seeing journal articles accepted in some fairly good, historically high quality journals, but accepted by an editor who isn't an expert on the topic that he's just accepted a paper on, and apparently on the basis of reviews by people who don't understand basic psychological theory, basic methodological practice, and basic statistical practice. I mean,
Craig's right. I mean, the article he talked about, this replication of the study they did on the newspapers and others, part of the issue today is a young reporter is told, get me two sides, that's what you're supposed to do. Trying to find another side which understands a meta-analysis or a logistic, regression or some of the really sophisticated things which are done are difficult, but you can find somebody.
Right.
And that becomes the other side, and that takes on exactly the same credibility as 90% of the other people. It's irrelevant. And from the naive reader, and that's what this one article talks about, the public would say, I guess it is conclusive. There has to be a debate. There's another side.
Well, there's massive fraud being perpetrated against the American public, and it's now being done by news media and even by professors. I mean, you couldn't get, like when I was involved with various talk shows and things on the issue of spanking children, you couldn't get someone to take the other side. And they couldn't find anyone to come on. And these one or two people popped up, and all of a sudden they were called for everything. They're on every news show because no one else will go on the news and take the position that hitting kids is good for them or is anything other than very dangerous and risky toward them.
But it makes a great show.
It makes a better show. And the media, a lot of the news stations are now more into entertainment than bringing us the facts. And the American public needs to know the facts. And that's one of the reasons why I put this show together, because I wanted to get the real researchers, the real deal here, telling the public directly what the research does show and what it doesn't show. So other than the fraud issue, though, why isn't the public taking the research more seriously? I realize they're not always getting the right information, but realistically, there is a lot more research out there consistent with the truth, consistent with your research, for example. Why is it the public is even listening to this other side, which is flimsy and really not very credible?
Let us count the ways. Want to go back and forth? We each take one?
You take one at a time until we get to 10. Okay, all right. I'll start with one of the easy ones. It's a lot of work as a parent to do what you need to do to create a healthy media diet for your child. It's very, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes thought, and it takes involvement. It's much easier to simply believe that there isn't really any harm. I heard it on TV or I saw it on the internet. So I don't have to do any of that.
Faulty reasoning. God, I mean, Uncle Max has been smoking cigars and he's 90 years old and nothing happened. I play first-person shooter games, haven't shot anybody at all. In fact, feel pretty good. What are they talking about?
Right.
another one of the sort of the cognitive dissonance ones. I used to play violent video games, and in fact, I did. I was an early adopter.
You did. You played Pong, right? One of the first versions of Pong.
Well, and I killed my first Klingon when I was in graduate school. A Star Trek video game back when it was played on a mainframe computer. But yeah, you'll get a lot of parents, a lot of people saying, "Well, gosh, I played violent video games when I was a kid, or I watched violent TV shows or violent cartoons, and I turned out okay." Right. This research suggests that there must be something wrong about me.
Right. The exact same thing takes place in corporal punishment. People say, well, I was spanked and I'm okay, and yet the research shows clearly that people spanked are more likely to have a divorce, they're more likely to have drug addictions, they're more likely to have health issues, they're more likely to have conflict in the home, more likely to have violence in the home. I mean, there's so much evidence against, and that's why so many Western European countries have banned even spanking in the home, and we're still struggling to get out of the schools in this country. But yeah, the "I was spanked, I'm okay" argument seems to be the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of Americans. But and I've heard an alcoholic say that. I'm like, you're not okay. You're like drinking every night like a fish. You're not okay.
You're not okay.
But they think they're okay, and also you don't want to blame your parents. I mean, no one wants to say my parent did something wrong, and that's where the cognitive dissonance comes into, I think.
Sure.
I mean, another is reactance. Craig talked about it a little earlier. Particularly in media, I play this, it's fine. You're trying to take away something that is fun for me.
Right.
And you want to censor. And it's interesting, there's a recent study of heavy game players that was done in Europe who are so anti the research, hate the researchers, don't believe the research at all. And when you ask them, we're a group. If you're attacking this, you're attacking what we do, and you want to censor. And the media is very different because it is something which has First Amendment types of protections, and it's called reactance. You're interfering with my life.
Well, we're out of time. I want to thank you both so much for coming here. I so appreciate
you.
your time. And you've been watching Meet the Professors. I'm your host, Professor Deana Pollard Sacks, and catch us next time.